year was 1973. Richard Nixon was president of the United States, and U.S. troops had been fighting in Vietnam for nearly 18 years, all without an official declaration of war. This prompted Congress to pass the War Powers Resolution of 1973, preventing any future president from involving the U.S. in an undeclared war. Congress had traditionally declared war or authorized the president to use military force against enemies beyond its borders, a power granted exclusively to them by Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, these were all declared by Congress. But after World War II, things got a bit fuzzy. Some presidents started taking military liberties with their role as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, a power also granted by the Constitution. In 1950, President Harry Truman sent U.S. troops to help defend South Korea against North Korean invaders. He called it a police action, so technically it wasn't a war. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy sent supplies and military advisors to South Vietnam. Less than a year later, U.S. troops were fighting in the Vietnam War, including in the Gulf of Tonkin, all without that official declaration. And then in 1969, President Richard Nixon began bombing Cambodia in secret, hiding missions from both Congress and the American people. It took more than a year for this information to leak to the public, and it wasn't until 1973 that Congress ordered an immediate end to the bombing raids. But at this point, Congress realized more needed to be done to check the power of the president when it came to war. So, on November 7, 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. The idea was to ensure that Congress and the president agreed on war actions before committing troops into hostile situations. There are a few key parts to the War Powers Resolution. First, the president must consult and report to Congress before sending troops overseas, though he or she can initiate sending troops in the case of an attack. Second, if the president initiates a hostile action, it can only last for 60 days plus a 30-day withdrawal period. Then, Congress has to vote on whether it can continue, unless Congress can't meet because of an attack on the U.S. mainland. And finally, if forces have been deployed that aren't acting on a declaration of war, the president must remove them at direction of Congress. Although the War Powers Resolution had broad bipartisan support, it didn't pass without a fight. After they voted to pass the bill, President Nixon vetoed it. Nixon argued that it violated the constitutional powers of the president, and that the only way to limit the president's role as commander-in-chief would be to amend the Constitution itself. But Congress voted again and overrode the veto. The War Powers Resolution became law. Despite the resolution, presidents and Congress have still been at odds when it comes to military action. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan deployed several U.S. military advisors to El Salvador without reporting to Congress. Some members of Congress filed a federal lawsuit, but the court dismissed the case. In the 90s, President Bill Clinton sent forces to Kosovo, and troops remained there for more than the 60-day limit. This resulted in another lawsuit from members of Congress, but once more, the federal court refused to intervene. So while the War Powers Resolution has limited the president's ability to send troops overseas, the branches of government still wrestle over their powers, which is exactly what the nation's founders intended.
Major escalation in tensions between the U.S. and Iran. The top Iranian general has been killed in an airstrike while leaving the Baghdad airport. The Pentagon confirmed the U.S. military carried out the attack. Qasem Soleimani was one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East and had been the top military man in Iran for more than 20 years. This attack comes after Iranian-backed groups breached the U.S. embassy in Baghdad just 2 days ago. We now turn to ABC's Kara Phillips, who's with President Trump in West Palm Beach, Florida. Kara.
When reports of the airstrike at the Baghdad airport broke tonight, there was one question on everyone's mind. Was the United States responsible? Well, the president was cryptic. He responded with only a picture, tweeting out the image of the American flag. My White House sources were able to confirm that not only did the strike happen, but it was ordered by President Trump. The Pentagon announcing that the strike did indeed kill the powerful commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, Qasem Soleimani, as well as the head of an Iranian-backed Iraqi militia. And it was ordered by President Trump. Now, here in the U.S., Republicans are calling this a success, saying Trump made a brave and correct call. But the president is also facing questions from his critics on Capitol Hill, asking if the United States carried out the assassination without authorization from Congress, potentially bringing this country to the brink of an all-out war.
Kira, thanks. Joining us now is ABC News Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz. Now, Martha, you were on the ground in Iraq with Soleimani not too long ago. What was his presence like there?
Well, when ISIS was taking over towns in Iraq, Soleimani would often be seen in Iraq, traveling back and forth between Iran and Iraq to help lead the fight, these Iranian-backed militias against ISIS. He was a very strong but very mysterious presence in Iraq. He was not high profile by any means, but people certainly knew he was there and certainly knew what he was doing in trying to defeat ISIS. But I will also say that his presence was felt throughout the war there because he was responsible for the deaths of many Americans, and I heard soldiers and generals and everyone talk about that and what the Iranians had done and the Iranian weapons that were present in Iraq and targeting American troops.
So clearly this is a victory tonight then for the Trump administration, but I would imagine that Iran will have a response, yes?
I think it's almost certain Iran will have some sort of response, even given what we've heard from them this evening in tweets, and that the United States in some way will pay for this. I think the important thing here to look at in any kind of Iranian response is whether they take credit for it. Remember with the attacks earlier this year on the Saudi oil fields and the drone attacks, they talked about the drone, but they did not talk about the Saudi oil fields. They did not take responsibility for those attacks. In fact, the foreign minister of Iran told me in person when I was in Tehran that some of those must have been photoshopped, that they weren't responsible for those things. So I think if Iran has some sort of response to the killing of Soleimani and they take credit for it, they are looking for a larger conflict. If they don't, I think they want to tamp this down.
Martha Raddatz, thank you so much. The attack tonight, killing the top general in Iran, is just the latest in a troubled relationship between the U.S. and Iran, one that's been ongoing for 40 years since the regime took American hostages. But last summer, tensions began to increase once again.
The U.S. calling the strike a success. For the Iranians, almost surely a call for retaliation. Iranian television announcing his death, saying Soleimani had been martyred after years of struggle for Islam. The Department of Defense confirming the attack, saying it was done, quote, at the direction of the president, adding this strike was aimed at deterring future Iranian attack plans. The attack came after continuing tension between the U.S. and Iran. In 2018, President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal brokered by President Obama.
This was a horrible, one-sided deal.
Just days ago on New Year's Eve,
Do I want to? No. I want to have peace. I like peace. And Iran should want peace more than anybody. So I don't see that happening.
in April, the U.S. State Department made the unprecedented step of labeling the Iranian National Guard a terrorist organization.
This historic step will deprive the world's leading state sponsor of terror the financial means to spread misery and death around the world.
By early May, the U.S. aircraft carrier had been deployed to the region. Then, a shocking escalation, a series of attacks on international oil tankers in the region's busy shipping channels.
Smoke billowed hundreds of feet high from one of the crippled oil tankers.
Tit for tat all leading up to a June 2019 attack on a U.S. drone. The Pentagon claims it was flying in international airspace, but Iran maintains the drone was in their territory. The Pentagon readies an airstrike, only to see a stunning reverse in course around 7 p.m. The U.S. military ready to launch warplanes and warships at Iranian targets. until one final meeting between the president and members of his national security team, where Trump made a dramatic reversal against the advice sources say of former National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. But he later told NBC News he changed his mind because the planned strikes were not proportionate to Iran's downing of an unmanned U.S. drone.
I thought about it for a second. I said, you know what? They shot down an unmanned drone, and here we are sitting with 150 dead people. That would have taken place probably within a half an hour after I said go ahead.
The president denying reports that planes were in the air and ships were in positions before he called off that strike. But that was not the case tonight. Tonight, the strike went off.
But the American people should know that President Trump's decision to remove Qasem Soleimani from the battlefield saved American lives. There's no doubt about that. He was actively plotting in the region to take actions, a big action as he described it, that would have put dozens, if not hundreds, of American lives at risk.
For too long, this evil man operated without constraint, and countless innocents have suffered for it. Now his terrorist leadership has been ended. Now, predictably enough, in this political environment, the operation that led to Soleimani's death may prove controversial or divisive.
It is my view that the president does not have the authority for a war with Iran. If he plans a large increase in troops and potential hostility over a longer time, the administration will require congressional approval and the approval of the American people. The president's decision may add to an already dangerous and difficult situation in the Middle East. The risk of a much longer military engagement in the Middle East is acute and immediate.
How significant is this? We killed the most powerful man in Iran, short of the Ayatollah. He was the right fist of the Ayatollah, and we took the Ayatollah's arm off.
This is a president who has been a horrible commander-in-chief when it comes to making us a more of a safe nation. Yeah. And now, potentially, we're going to see what the fallout of this is and see if indeed it's part of a larger strategy, which unfortunately with his record, I doubt it is.
I've said for a long time that going to war with Iran would make the war in Iraq and even Afghanistan look like a picnic. It will be far more costly and devastating in American lives and in taxpayer dollars. And I don't believe the American people want to go to war.
As we all remember, Trump promised to end endless wars. Tragically, his actions now put us on the path to another war, potentially one that could be even worse than before.
If we have learned nothing else from the Middle East in the last 20 years, it's that taking out a bad guy is not a good idea unless you are ready for what comes next.
I think it's really important for New Yorkers to understand that we are now potentially facing a threat that's different and greater than anything we have faced previously.
His sole job was to just export terrorism throughout the Middle East and do so in Iraq. To be caught right there in Baghdad is appropriate. But it also shows that this president, using our military, our intelligence, our State Department, doesn't draw red lines.
But in real time, making these decisions, you can't make a decision to take out a key general by committee. It just doesn't work that way. It never has worked that way, and candidly can't work that way in the future.
We're not going to lament his death. But the question is that has to be answered by the administration next week when Congress comes back into session is what brought us to this moment. We have had other moments in which we could have taken Soleimani out. We did not.